We're moving into section 3 today, and this section is going to focus on part 2 of the speaking test. You'll know this as the talk, but this is also called the long turn. And we're going to move back to the idea of fluency and coherence in band descriptor terms. And specifically, we're looking at the idea of dividing and organizing your part 2 talk, as well as planning your talk using the strategy of segmenting. Now, what is this? What is segmenting? Well, segmenting is the act of breaking something large up into smaller, more manageable parts. Consider an orange for a moment. Do you think you could fit an entire orange in your mouth? Well, if you could, that would be pretty impressive, but you probably can't. And this is the reason that we have orange segments, because we need to break those up into smaller, more manageable parts. Notice here, segment is the noun, segment is the verb. The same idea applies to our talk in part 2. It can be hard for the examiner to digest and understand what we're saying if we don't break up our talk into smaller, more manageable parts. But if we do break up our talk, if we segment, we appear much more fluent and coherent, and that's where the score for fluency and coherence comes in. So how do we do this? How do we segment? Let's look at a topic card to begin with. It's for the task of describe a child that you know. You may want to read this through just for a moment and consider how you might respond to this topic card. Now, the act of segmenting is a 3-step process. Step 1 is a case of finding the simple parts of the topic card, locating any parts that I have called black and white, so information that we can provide without needing to give much extra information. In this case, the information on the card is who the child is and how old the child is. Really simple information. Who the child is, it's Leah, it's my niece. How old the child is 7 years old. Quite black and white information. No need to support this here. Now, these parts of the talk will come first, as they're too small to form their own supported segments. So they're just going to all appear at the beginning. It doesn't matter that how old the child is comes after how often you see them. So the talk does not need to run in the order of the card. So the introduction to your talk may look something like this. I'm going to talk about my niece. Her name is Leah, she's 7 years old, and she's my older sister's second child. Nice and simple, strong, accurate start. Moving on to step 2, this will form the bulk of your talk. This is a case of writing down 3 points for each of the remaining prompts or bullet points on the topic card. If possible, follow the idea, support, example strategy, ISE or ICE, if you want to keep that in your mind, to give you a clear sense of progression. Now let's have a look at what this looks like in practice. One of the remaining prompts on the card is how often you see him or her. So how often? Idea, once a week. Support, Sundays, family meal, being a bit more specific. Example, I saw her last Sunday. Let's keep going. What she's like, that's the next prompt. Idea, intelligent, naughty. Support, she takes after her mum. That means that she's like her mum. We talk about takes after when we think about children and their parents. And example, she helped her brother with his maths homework, but she didn't do her own. And finally, how do you feel about this child? Well, I feel protective. That's the idea. Why do I feel protective? That's the support. I feel protective because she can be quite clumsy. For example, I took her to the park and I had to watch her like a hawk. That's an idiom that we use. Now notice that I'm not using perfect grammar here. You'll notice the missing article before the word hawk, for example. That doesn't matter. When you're planning, forget about the grammar, forget about the spelling. It's all about the speed and the content that you put down on the page. Now, moving to the final step, step 3. And this is all about how we introduce different segments of the response. Now, with the first part of the talk, this should always begin the same way. I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about my dog, I'm going to talk about my holiday, I'm going to talk about my job, I'm going to talk about my niece, I'm going to talk about my favorite hobby, whatever it is. This will make sure you have an accurate start and that you're not stumbling from the very beginning. But after you've done this, you have options for introducing the other segments. You can either go direct, you go straight into your answer. So how often you see him or her? I see her about once a week. Or you can create this more indirect introduction to the answer of that part of the topic card. With regards to how often I'd see her, I'd say it's about once a week. As for what the child is like, she's a very intelligent child, but quite naughty, very direct. Or the introduction response, as for what she's like, I'd describe her as intelligent but quite naughty. And the last one, how do you feel about the child? Straight into it, I tend to feel quite protective over her. Or the introduction response, if I think about how I feel about her, I'd say I'm quite protective. Notice how all the introduction responses use the I'd form. So with regards to, I'd. As for, I'd. If I think about, I'd say, I'd describe, etc. So make sure you use those as well. Now, when you're planning, make sure you write a D or an I next to each of your columns with their 3 points. And then this way, you won't stumble over your words worrying about how you're going to begin your segment. Let's have a look at what this looks like in practice, looking at my plan for this talk on this topic card. Now, black and white information, write it down very, very quickly. The intro is going to be niece, Leah, 7 years old, sister's second child. Notice my note form of writing here. Then, columns for each of the remaining points. How often? Idea, once a week. Support, Sundays. Example, last week. What she's like. Idea, intelligent, naughty. Support, takes after mum. Example, brother's math homework. Finally, how I feel about her. Idea, protective. Support, can be clumsy. Example, park, use the hawk idiom. Again, notice the note forms that I'm using. I didn't write the word intelligent. I wrote the word intel and then a little asterisk because I know what I want to say. Make sure you improve on that speed. Finally, we have to think about how we're going to introduce each of the segments. We know how we're introducing the first one I'm going to talk about, but what about the columns? Well, it's up to you. I've gone with D, direct, I for an introduction, and then another D, direct. Now, this may seem quite difficult to do in 1 minute, but it can be done with practice. If you want to save a bit of time, you can try replacing the titles of the columns with letters. So WSL for what she's like, HO for how often, and so forth. Okay, so how can we bring this all together into a model answer? Now, a reminder of the topic card. Have a look at this through. You may want to practice this yourself before you hear my response, maybe even use the plan that I provided. And let's have a look at the answer. So you can time me here. Let's get started. I'm going to talk about my niece. Her name is Leah. She's 7 years old and she's my older sister's second child. I see her about once a week. She goes to school during the week, but all our family usually get together on Sundays for a family meal. In fact, I saw her just a few days ago for our Sunday lunch, along with her 2 brothers, and we all had a lovely time together. As for what she's like as a person, I'd describe her as very intelligent, but a bit naughty. I think she takes after her mum in that way, who was just like that when we were kids. For instance, just the other day, Leah was helping her older brother with his maths homework. But when it came to doing her own, she refused and had a tantrum. I can remember my sister doing something very similar when she was that age. I guess I tend to feel quite protective over her. which is probably because she's quite prone to being quite clumsy. She's already had quite a few accidents in her time, so it's important to keep a close eye on her. I took her to the park a few weeks ago, for example, and I had to watch her like a hawk while she was on the swings just to make sure she didn't fall off. Still, she's a really fun child to be around, and she always makes me laugh. Now, what you may find if you timed that was that may be under 2 minutes, maybe more like 1 minute 30. It's more likely to be around 2 minutes for you. Non-native speakers tend to speak a little bit more slowly. They may make a couple of errors and have to correct themselves. But I'm also deliberately speaking slowly myself because I want to make my talk very, very clear. I want to make all my pronunciation very clear. We talked about that in the previous section, the importance of not going too quickly. Anyway, hopefully that gave you a good idea of how you can plan your part 2 talk and how you can deliver your part 2 talk using the strategy of segmenting.